This is Top of Mind. Thanks for tuning in today. I'm Julie Rose. In the early 1900s, it was legal for people in America to be sterilized against their will. The Supreme Court even said so. After the Nazi horrors came to light, though, most states stopped enforcing their eugenics laws. Even so, there were people up into the 1970s who were being forced into sterilization because they were poor, black, disabled, in prison, or just deemed unfit to be a parent. We hope that's all in the past, right? But have you ever thought to yourself, that person really should not be having kids? Parents with intellectual disabilities in America, for example, have their children removed by the state up to 80% of the time, according to the National Council on Disability. Have we fully learned the lessons of our dark history with eugenics? Paul Lombardo joins me now on the line from Georgia State University, where he's an historian and law professor. His latest book is A Century of Eugenics in America, from the Indiana Experiment to the Human Genome Era. Welcome, Professor. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Julie.
Can you briefly describe what was going on in the public mindset in America in the early 1900s that made it so widely acceptable that somebody could be sterilized against their will?
Well, there were a whole series of ideas that centered around the idea of heredity. And the suggestion was that certain people got to be the way they were, that many people got to be they were because of traits they'd inherited from their parents and them from their grandparents and on down the line. And so if you were a criminal, the thought was that you probably inherited that propensity from someone in your family. And if you were poor, maybe the same thing. If you were disabled, promiscuous, immoral in lots of different ways. It was thought that many behavioral propensities were something that you got when you were born and you really couldn't escape, and you were likely to pass down to your own children.
And so the driving force or the idea behind these laws that more than half of states had in America was that we needed to protect children from being born into these circumstances, or we needed to protect society from being polluted in some way?
Kind of all of the above. There was certainly a concern that some people weren't particularly good parents, and that idea actually played out much longer than the ideas of some direct heredity, which would mark people for having bad children. So there was concern about children, yes. There was concern that certain traits were really part of a family's heritage, and so the concern was that there were institutions that had been built in the previous 100 years, asylums and hospitals and almshouses and all kinds of places that cost public money that actually were part of the tax burden, according to the way some people thought, and therefore you could do away with your taxes. You could certainly lower them if you didn't have people like that who had to be taken care of. So the concerns that led to the laws were both an idea that we could erase social problems medically, but also that we could erase social costs the same way.
And these laws held up in court, there were people who tried to challenge them, right, to object to the state order that they be sterilized.
There clearly were objections. In the earliest years, there were people who simply hired a lawyer and said, we're not going to let you do this. And several of those cases got into state courts. And they had a mixed response. There were several states in which the laws were overturned very quickly. New York was one of those, for example. I don't think they sterilized anyone. Whereas other states, like California, sterilized many people. Some state laws were overturned. A few of them were just set aside by the administrators. They just didn't sterilize anybody. But it wasn't until about the 1920s that one law got all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and that was the law from Virginia that was passed in 1924. And that law eventually was upheld as constitutional by the Supreme Court in the famous case of Buck versus Bell, in which the Supreme Court, speaking through Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, said 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And marked a family that had people who had at least 2 people, a mother and her daughter, who were in a state facility as being the examples of the kind of people they didn't want to have any more children.
And that was so I think that ruling happened in 1927, upholding the right of the state to order individuals to be sterilized if they were deemed I guess, imbeciles. That was the definition. Like if you weren't smart
Well,
enough.
the broader phrase in the law was socially inadequate, and it was meant to include people with cognitive disabilities. It also it swept pretty broadly and included lots of people who were being supported by public money in various kinds of institutions.
And what was the consequence then of that ruling of the Supreme Court saying, yeah, states can do this?
Well, for one thing, it meant that there were many fewer challenges to the laws. Secondly, it meant that, and at that time there were probably 14 or 15 laws that were in place. And after that, it meant that other states felt comfortable that they could pass laws modeled on laws like Virginia's or California's or Indiana's, all of which had been upheld, and that they would not be subject to liability and they wouldn't be overturned.
Do we have the sense that they were used widely, these laws, to actually require that people be sterilized?
Yes. By the time that all of the laws were finally repealed or at least not used, which would have been the 1970s or 80s in some cases, there were something on the order of 65,000 people who had been sterilized all over the country. The largest number of something like 20,000 in California, and then states like Virginia had about 8,500, and Georgia had another 4,000 or 5,000, and several other states were also fairly large. But that's the official number. We don't really know how many people were sterilized off the books or without using these laws.
The individuals who were being sterilized would know that this is what was happening to them?
Well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. They were supposed to be told. The laws all said that people had to get notice and the opportunity to oppose them, and in most cases to hire an attorney if they needed to. But what happened in practice was a lot more difficult to track. People were sometimes told that they were having some kind of an operation like appendicitis, and then as a result of that operation, they were also sterilized at the same time. Other people, women, were told they were being treated to cure their sexually transmitted diseases that they might have, and they were sterilized at the same time. So there were lots of operations done under subterfuge, and we've learned about some of those very clearly being done. Sometimes on people who didn't understand what was going on, but other times on people who later found out that they had been sterilized and just not told. Yeah.
Also cases of women being coerced, told you're going to lose your welfare benefits if you don't agree to do this and stop having kids, or being told it's reversible, just do it now, kind of a thing. So a lot of bad information. Did the Supreme Court, Paul Lombardo, ever overturn its decision, though, in that Buck v. Bell case? Is it still being used as precedent today in America?
It's seriously questionable that it's being used in a legal sense. The law was never, the Virginia law was never overturned, and for that matter, no state law was overturned in the case. That is to say that the Supreme Court never revisited this topic. And so, at least technically, the law has not been overturned. There are no states now that have the eugenic sterilization laws that existed, from 1907 to the 1970s, although people still are sterilized under some state statutes that allow for a court order to do this. Other people are probably sterilized all the time, and with no involvement by the courts or any legal authorities.
Is the ability today then the ability to reproduce? Does the U.S. legal system recognize that as a fundamental right, regardless of your income or your mental state or your physical state?
Well, I think when we talk about reproductive rights, we're talking about a moving target. It's clear that since the 1960s, the Supreme Court has said that there was a right to privacy which allowed for people to make decisions about reproduction, whether to have children or not, whether to use birth control or not. That was the first decision in the 60s. And then, of course, the infamous and famous Roe versus Wade decision, which was in the 1970s, which has been the subject of political debate ever since, of whether or not it was up to individuals and their families, and women particularly, to decide that they wanted to have or not have children. And the idea of reproductive rights has really been read as what we call a negative liberty. In other words, something where the government should leave you alone to make that decision by yourself or with the help of a physician. We're living in an age in which these ideas are continually challenged.
But you have also noted that not so long ago, couples were required to get a blood test before getting a marriage license in a lot of states, which has its root in some of the eugenic thinking we've been discussing. Describe that.
No question about it. The eugenic marriage laws, as they were called, starting in about 1910, were passed all over the country, and they were passed as a means of testing people before they got married. It was a condition of marriage, first for men. It was only for men for a long time, and then also for men and women. And the idea was that you couldn't have healthy babies if so many babies were dying of sexually transmitted diseases like syphilis or gonorrhea. And so as a condition of marriage, you had to have a test. And people wonder, why did they call this eugenics? Well, the root of the word eugenics is to be well born. There was a great concern that babies were dying, that there was a high rate of infant mortality, and that families in general were being ruined by the discovery that somebody had one of these diseases. And so those laws stayed in place, again, almost 100 years.
Where have we settled, though, on this question of the right of a child to be well born or to be well raised, even? I mentioned in the introduction that, it's apparently quite common for parents with intellectual disabilities, also psychiatric disabilities, to have their children removed by the state. So what does the law say about what a child's right is?
Well, what the law says is that, in general, parents have the right to raise children in a way that they think is appropriate. And there's a lot of range there as to what's appropriate. But every state has a state law which says that in the event that children are abused or neglected, the state can step in and act as kind of the parent of us all. There's a Latin phrase from the Old English of parens patriae, the parent of the country. The state can step in and protect children, and so that can happen. The difficulty there is deciding and defining what it is that it means to be neglected or abused. Obviously, when the abuse is significant, when there's no real disagreement. But when do we say that a parent is simply unfit and unable to safely raise a child? That too is a moving target.
Yeah. Are there cases that have worried you, and in terms of how states are drawing that line about what it means to be a fit parent?
Well, I think your general point that people with disabilities have always been chosen as the people to challenge in terms of their parenting skills, and the bar is set for them in the way that it's not for everyone else. There is an assumption that if you are disabled, that somehow that's going to be bad for your child, which is an assumption which is not borne out in practice most of the time, but it's still a bias that many people have in mind when they're deciding who they think ought to be an appropriate parent. We don't have a test for parenthood more generally. And if we did, it would be interesting to see how it would be applied to the population at large.
Right. I mean, is letting your kid eat junk food for breakfast, is it gonna cause you to fail the test?
Well, exactly. These are often matters of opinion rather than they are being able to prove anything as a scientific fact.
Speaking with Paul Lombardo, who is a professor of law at Georgia State University, he's written numerous books and articles on the history of eugenics in America. There was a case actually in Oregon that got resolved about a year ago. That a couple had fought for 4 years before finally regaining custody of their young children. And part of the state's justification for removing those children was the low IQ of the parents. They'd take an IQ test apparently, and then there were some things cited by the father of one of the woman, the female in that couple. Things like they gave their kids chicken nuggets as snacks, which is not a healthy choice. That they didn't have sunscreen all over the child's body; they only just put sunscreen on the baby's face. So things like that, which there was a lot of kind of disagreement about. Well, gosh, where are we drawing the line? Again, like you said. But on the question of IQ, has IQ often been part of the discussion, even going back into the eugenics history in America, giving people an IQ test and saying you got to hit this bar, otherwise we don't think you're fit?
Well, IQ tests were often the kind of threshold that was used early in the 20th century, and actually throughout the 20th century, as the cutoff point for starting to ask questions about people's ability. It's not a terribly good test of many things that have to do with practical living, but in the earlier years it was even less worthwhile when people weren't able to even reliably apply IQ testing to groups of people. So, as someone was picked up and taken to the local asylum or the home for the feeble-minded, they were the first thing that happened to them is they were given an IQ test. And sometimes those IQ tests were simply used as the excuse to say, oh, we've got the right person. IQ tests are notoriously difficult to predict from. We can take people and give them IQ tests at one age and then subject them to intense training, and their IQ tests increase, or the scores increase. And there are certainly some people that doesn't happen, but in general, being certain that you know what someone's going to do or how they're going to perform in life based on an IQ test would not be a very broad-based way of evaluating them.
Can you discuss, Paul Lombardo, where you think the right balance is when a state is or a court is, faced with making a decision? The parents of an individual, an adult who has developmental disabilities, have petitioned to have their child sterilized because they're concerned that their child may not be able to fully consent to a sexual relationship, that they won't be able to care for a child, those kinds of things. Where is that balance? What, in terms of how drastic the intervention ought to be, and whether or not the individual themselves has the ability, no matter how limited, to express their own desires in that case?
Well, I think that there are two sides that I look at this from. The first side is it ever appropriate to decide that someone else can't have children? And the states have done, in differing degrees, have done a lot of work on this. Some states saying, here's our statute that says you cannot sterilize someone who cannot give consent unless there is a whole laundry list of things going on. And it takes a lot of evaluation by not just physicians, but certainly by people in social work and mental health and other areas, to try to figure out whether under some set of circumstances someone might be able to be a good or adequate parent. And those are questions that I certainly can't answer. But the problem is when you allow those laws to be applied to someone in a random way, it's almost always people with disabilities who are told that they can't have children because it wouldn't be good for those children to grow up in the context of having a parent with limitations. I think that, if I were king of the world, I'd say that any rules like that had to be rules of general application. In other words, if you're going to make a rule about who cannot have children, the rule ought to apply to everyone, and it shouldn't just be based on IQ. I think if we went into families of people who are very wealthy and who went to all the best schools and said, you have to prove to us that you are a good parent, we would find that those people would often be feeding their children chicken nuggets and worse as well.
Why do you think it is that we finally, Paul Lombardo, when it comes to reproduction and parenting, we seem to gravitate toward really dramatic interventions in society? Why is that?
Well, this is a big question. Why is it that parenting? I mean, because I think parenting, and we all, on the good side, we all are concerned about children. We all think that children should have, at least in the abstract, all of the possibilities and not have any potential taken away from them by their context. We don't behave that way, though. We certainly don't. In the developing world, or the developed world, I should say, most places do much better than the United States when it comes to making sure that education is available, making sure that health care is available, making sure that prenatal care is available for women, making sure that parents have time to take care of their children through programs in the workplace. I think it's a dramatic idea that we should be protecting children from everything, but I think it would be a more dramatic idea if we actually said we're going to actually pay for those things to happen so that children do grow up with the best possible context that they can.
Paul Lombardo is an historian and a professor of law at Georgia State University. His books include A Century of Eugenics in America, from the Indiana Experiment to the Human Genome Era, and also 3 Generations, No Imbeciles, Eugenics, the Supreme Court, and Buck v. Bell. Thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Julie. Bye-bye.
This is Top of Mind. I'm Julie Rose.